The crystalline blade slid through her ribs like light through water, impossibly cold and impossibly precise, and Elena Ruiz realized with a scientist's clarity that the thing lodged inside her chest was not physical at all, but a memory, foreign and living, an image of a planet's pale ocean dissolving into black, the imprint of 1,000 small, deliberate wounds laid on a map of continents. She clutched at the hut's corrugated wall as the plateau pitched beneath her. The night across the Atacama opened like a wound. Oris' voice wasn't voice, no. It was a contour of thought pressing at the edges of her mind, and it said, without sympathy, without ceremony, "You must leave Earth in 2026. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Elena hadn't slept in 48 hours. That wasn't unusual when she was waiting for mineral spectrometers to cool or for satellite pings to fall into silence. But this was the kind of exhaustion that lives beneath the skin, the hollowing after a lifetime of staying too late in labs and nodding at classified attachments she had been told to ignore. The cratered plateau hummed with insect chirps and the distant faint wash of diesel engines from the mining towns 3 valleys over. Her field tent smelled of ozone and coffee and the stale breath of the Andes. She tasted metal and salt and something older, salt that belonged to seas she had only seen in photographs, as if Oris had borrowed someone else's memory to burrow into her. When she finally opened her eyes, the plateau had changed. The stars were not stars. They were facets of a structure, hovering half a meter above the ground like a cathedral minus priest. The envoy, Oris, stood in the clearing as if it had been waiting the whole of human history for this night. It was not tall the way humans think of tall. It was a composition of light and moving planes, an engineer's geometry animated. Within it, Elena saw something like a rib cage of opal and a face that rearranged into the suggestion of one when she blinked, an emulator of eyes, a membrane that shivered with data. "Why me?" she asked aloud, because the human voice is a steady thing to anchor to when the world rearranges. Her throat was a desert. Oris' presence folded, a paper crane becoming a sword, and the thought that arrived was crisp and alien. You signed for the extraction, the one in southern Chile. You did not read the attachments. She flinched. Of course she had read them. She had read as much as she had been permitted. A younger Elena had been proud then, back at the university, recommending the collection of a sequence of microbial samples from a remote saline sink. They came flagged as atypical, as something that might illuminate extremophile metabolism with implications for bioremediation.
She had been flattered to be chosen to sign the chain of custody for transfer to a classified program. It was a mundane thing, a signature on a digital form, the clicking of a mouse. Later, she learned the rest in snippets, redacted memos, a hushed conversation in a corridor, something about engineering vectors, about symbiont scaffolds. She had let it go because the sanctity of research meant trusting institutions. That trust had been a bargain she paid with naivety. "Explain," she said, "because pressure is the form grief takes inside a scientist." Oris projected a lattice of images into her mind, solar systems like ornamented beads, a fleet of small craft moving between them, human spirals of consumption mapped like heat signatures. When the envoy's translation wove words back into syllables that could sit on her lips, it did so without warmth. "Your species replicates and colonizes with a ferocity we call veracity. This yields danger for us." Elena's rational mind was cataloging the claim: species-level threat assessment, anthropocentric expansion patterns, recognized in ecological terms. But underneath, something else thrummed, a private gnawing fear that what she'd touched back in the lab years ago might be a fault line. "Are you saying my signature did this?" she whispered. Oris' response was a slow folding of light, neither denial nor absolution. The envoy spoke of thresholds, technology that enabled new kinds of expansion, cultural habits that encouraged exploitation, and human aggression that, if funneled into space, would be catastrophic for other life forms. Some among us, Oris' presence admitted, insist on containment. The envoy's modifiers made Elena scalp crawl. Containment meant corridors, erasures, the quiet pruning of a dangerous bloom. "I have been sent to offer a way out," Oris concluded. "Leave before the year when your technology, structurally seeded by your species' choices, becomes a vector." She laughed.
because laughter is usually the next reflex when the world tips. It sounded small in the tent. "You want me to run?" "Not run," Oris said. The concept pressed at her like a cold palm. "Evacuate to a sanctuary. As a steward, you carry knowledge. We can shelter you. Or you can stay and amplify." Outside, sand scratched like applause. Inside, Elena felt the familiar architecture of her life. Graduate teaching, a published paper, a resignation letter filed 6 months ago to pursue fieldwork out of guilty curiosity, tear, and the memory of signing that file like a stitch in a seam. The thought that a single signature, over years of bureaucracy, could be part of a mechanism that turned human ingenuity into hazard was a mortality she hadn't prepared to feel. She had just enough strength to reach for the satellite beacon she'd been calibrating, a little gyroscopic device cheap enough for fieldwork, not for spacefaring. Before she could commit to dial it, the sound of a vehicle on the plateau made all the sand shiver.
A pair of headlights mounted the ridge. A truck, black as a rumor, crawled toward the tent before stalling and going still. A man stepped out with the unstable gait of someone who had spent too many nights awake in too many government briefing rooms. Kai Mercer looked like he had been watered down, exhausted, weathered, clothes that once had fit tailored into fatigue. He had a surveillance team's careful eyes, but his expression was something else, relief wedged with dread. "Dr. Ruiz," he said, "you're impossible to find, and yet here we are." The intelligence in his voice had a softness that surprised her. Not the blunt instrument of operations, but a tired cat who had been forced to hunt. Elena didn't trust humans easily. Among strangers, she trusted data. But she was also a scientist who, in her worst moments, confessed to the universe in whispers, "I am human." "Who sent you?" she asked. He half smiled. "No one sent me. I track anomalies. That light? I've been hearing reports. I came because I'd rather know than not. Because when they call it an anomaly, it usually means someone's lying." Kai's story unraveled in halting threads. He had been an intelligence operative, once a reliable conduit of truths and untruths. After a career buried in disinformation, he'd walked away, haunted by operations that targeted domestic activists, by classified programs that had no ethical oversight. He had kept one secret, the existence. A pair of headlights mounted the ridge. A truck, black as a rumor, crawled toward the tent before stalling and going still. A man stepped out with the unstable gait of someone who had spent too many nights awake in too many government briefing rooms. Kai Mercer looked like he had been watered down, exhausted, weathered, clothes that once had fit tailored into fatigue. He had a surveillance team's careful eyes, but his expression was something else, relief wedged with dread. "Dr. Ruiz," he said, "you're impossible to find, and yet here we are." The intelligence in his voice had a softness that surprised her. Not the blunt instrument of operations, but a tired cat who had been forced to hunt. Elena didn't trust humans easily. Among strangers, she trusted data. But she was also a scientist who, in her worst moments, confessed to the universe in whispers, "I am human." "Who sent you?" she asked. He half smiled. "No one sent me. I track anomalies. That light? I've been hearing reports. I came because I'd rather know than not. Because when they call it an anomaly, it usually means someone's lying." Kai's story unraveled in halting threads. He had been an intelligence operative, once a reliable conduit of truths and untruths. After a career buried in disinformation, he'd walked away, haunted by operations that targeted domestic activists, by classified programs that had no ethical oversight. He had kept one secret, the existence of transmissions in isolated bands of the spectrum, thin crystalline pulses that didn't register on normal catalogs. He had spent months building small listening posts across the Chilean highlands and nodes in remote deserts. He had not expected to find an envoy, but he had expected that whatever it was would intersect with humans who had signed odd contracts and shipped unusual samples out of hidden airports. "You left the agency," Elena observed. It was a statement, not a question. "Left isn't the verb," Kai said. "I was pushed out with my conscience. I kept my hands intact, but my silence cost others. I'm trying to undo that." He looked at Oris with the mixture of fascination and suspicion of a man who had negotiated with governments that hid better lies by prettier plaids. "Why him, or her, it, choose you?" Elena swallowed, and the memory of signatures came back like an old film. "Because I signed something," she said, the admission like bitter coffee. "Because I thought I was helping a study. Because I told myself it would be contained. Because I wanted to believe institutions worked for good." Kai's jaw tightened. It's never that simple. Oris watched them both as if the calculus of their lives were a small, fascinating experiment. We detected multiple factors, Oris said finally. Your species' behavior indicates a 97% probability of systemic replication to others within 3 human generations if I'd checked. Some of us advocate for intervention, some for shadow pruning. I am assigned to offer you options. The first is departure.
And the second? Kai asked. The envoy's membranes shimmered like the inside of a shell. The second is negotiation, a treaty that alters your trajectory through oversight, integration of constraints, and cultural exchange. Such a treaty requires transparency. It requires sacrifice of secrecy you both may find impossible. Silence fell. The night wrapped them like a hand. Elena felt suddenly, savagely, the web of her life. Her mentor who'd smiled when she endorsed that file, the anonymous technicians, the children of facilities she had never visited. Nothing about containment was clean. Nothing about leaving felt purely noble. The ethical scales in her gut tilted under the weight of persons, not just abstractions. You gave us a deadline, she said, voice shakier than she'd like. 3 years, 2026. Why now? Why me? Oris' answer did not come like a human's. It came as a memory, a shape that showed a table of images, a small child with a hybrid eye, a launch pad shrouded in secrecy, a human colony module floating in low orbit with no public acknowledgement. A slow building of human capability and institutional blindness. We are not omniscient, Oris admitted, but we observe patterns. The timeline accelerates. Your instrumentality is increasing. You are on a vector that bears on us. Kai cursed under his breath. There are things I know. He met Elena's gaze with something like a dare. There are modules in low orbit. There are children who are not registered in any census. There are logs that my old colleagues buried. If this is true, if they are using what your sample enabled to build off-planet, then leaving won't make it stop, Elena said. Her hands trembled around the rim of her thermos. The scientist in her cataloged probabilities, and the woman in her cataloged guilt. Oris folded their presence into a small, private space of shared perception. We offer sanctuary for one. We offer to erase evidence for a colony if you leave, to sever traces. We offer alternatively to facilitate transparency with risk. We cannot restrain your institutions. We can only present options. Kai's mouth went hard. So you're here to decide whether to save a human or to let them become a plague on the cosmos. To moderate risk, or as corrected, to protect diversity. Who gets to be saved? Elena asked. Her voice was small in the wide plateau. Oris's membrane pulsed, and the envoy looked at her with the carefully calibrated attention of a scientist studying a fragile organism. You, Elena Ruiz, because of your connection to the node. You, Kai Mercer, for what your skills might reveal, and others will be considered in negotiation if you choose to stay. Elena felt the world narrow to the space between her two choices, departure and fight, and to the man standing in dusty boots whose life had been a patchwork of secrets she neither wanted nor deserved to fully understand. The plateau smelled of iron. Above them, the facets of Oris glittered like accusation.
The choice was not only about her body or her conscience. It was about whether to trust an inscrutable power capable of swiping history clean with a thought, or to stay and risk the worst of human snares. Give me time, she said, though she knew time was not a luxury they had. Oris' presence wasn't unkind when it accepted the plea. It simply tilted, as if accepting a hypothesis to test. Kai sat on a rock and put his head in his hands, the kind of gesture that reveals a man who had never believed the only solace left to him could be someone else's bravery. If we stay, he murmured, we might die trying to expose them. If we leave, we might save our skin and our knowledge, but we might betray those children. Elena's hands were cold. The memory of the saline sample in a cold room flashed, a vial, labeled, a signature. She thought of those hybrid eyes Oris had shown, fragmented dreams of human children with gifts nobody admitted to training. Her throat ached with a fury she had never given permission to have. Then we don't leave right away, she said. We ask questions. We find the truth. If it's as you say, if they are building weapons out of biology or colonizing in secret, then we expose them. And if the cost is our lives, then so be it. Oris's light dimmed to a tender glimmer.
as if the envoy had the luxury of patience. "We will offer a corridor of communication. But you must know, should your institutions move to weaponize what they already possess, the year will not matter. You will catalyze what you fear." Kai exhaled, a ragged noise that might have been a laugh or a sob. Elena felt, for the first time since the envoy's arrival, a small, fierce thread of connection to the man beside her. He had kept secrets because he thought it kept people safe. She had signed because she thought it kept science honest. Both illusions had led them to a cliff. "Then we start by naming what we know," she said. "We pool information. We test Oris claims. We set a timeline. If the state moves, we move faster. If we are betrayed, we broadcast everything." Kai's eyes lifted to meet hers. There was fear there, but also a brittle hope. "You're either the bravest or the stupidest person I ever met, Dr. Ruiz." "Call me Elena," she said. The invitation between them was small, human, a fragile tether on a night when the universe offered her refuge. In the same breath, it threatened to erase it. Oris recorded the exchange as efficiently as a machine catalog. It did not smile. Smiles, the envoy implied, were a human affectation, but there was something like acknowledgement. "Agreement logged," it said. "We will remain in communication. We will not remove your memory except at your request." As dawn began to smudge the edges of the plateau, they made plans fragile as paper boats. A list of names, a set of coordinates, a few lines of code that could become a broadcast. The envoy shimmered like a question mark over their heads.
The world had cracked open, and in the fissures stood Elena Ruiz, who once had trusted signatures and instruments above all. She tasted the salt of the ocean Oris had shown her in the crystalline blade of the envoy's memory, and understood that the thing they had to choose between was less escape than stewardship. The sun came up slow and red, flattening the plateau into a clipboard of light. Elena felt the dawn like a bruise. Logic and dread pulsed in the same rhythm. They moved more like thieves than conspirators, because every truth they gathered felt stolen from hands that had signed away accountability. Kai drove the truck down a winding service road, with Oris folded into the back seat of the world, inscrutable and patient, its facets changing colors in sympathy with the sky. They had a list the envoy had helped compile. 3 names, 2 remote facilities, 1 archived server no one in the public sector admitted existed. The first name belonged to a technician Elena remembered in passing from her university days, Mateo Alvarez, a man with a talent for keeping things cold and cataloged. Elena had recommended him for funding once, back when the world seemed to let you choose morality like a research question. She felt a physical lurch thinking of the mail of her past, the green of grant forms, the phosphorylation of things she had tried to measure and failed. She forced herself to speak. "Mateo's the easiest. He still writes to the lab emails. He's been loyal to the work, even when the work lied." Kai's fingers drummed the wheel. Loyalty is a currency in these circles. Sometimes it's love. Sometimes it's fear. We'll need more than one person who'll risk being wrong. They arrived in the morning heat. The mining town at the foot of the plateau looked like it had been photographed from a different century. Corrugated iron roofs, a funeral of billboards half peeled away. Mateo's small hardware shop smelled of solder and old paper. He looked older than his last email signature suggested, his hair threaded with a tired silver. When Elena mentioned the sample collection, Mateo's face tightened into a map of places he didn't want to visit. "You signed off?" He asked the question without looking at her, and for a second he looked like someone holding his breath. "I did." Her voice was small. "I didn't know the rest." Mateo laughed a brittle laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Nobody does. Not until the machines get loud enough to be undeniable. They get louder because someone gives them a key." He set down a wrench as if he needed an anchor. "We rigged sensors for them." He meant, in ways he didn't fully say, satellite taps, relay nodes tucked in the ribs of decommissioned weather stations, data slurps that fed secret nets. "Some of it," he said. "We thought it was just for climate models." Kai watched Mateo like a surgeon watches a knife.
He kept scanning, hands resting lightly on the bag of equipment where his old life still lingered, encrypted drives, a burner phone, a jammer. He had to resist the temptation to use everything he once had at the agency. The skills that kept him alive also scarred the lives of those he loved. He had come here because secrecy had become a weapon he no longer wanted in his hands. From Mateo, they got breadcrumb data, timestamps of launches nobody announced, a fragment of an orbital manifest misfiled under agricultural modules, and a photograph of a cluster of children in a sealed courtyard, eyes not exactly like human eyes, glints that suggested something engineered. Mateo's hands trembled as he handed them a scrubbed hard drive. I don't want to die for this, Elena. I will if I have to, but I don't want my silence to be the coal that feeds the furnace. Elena took the drive with fingers that felt unfamiliar in their steadiness. Whatever human warmth had been built into her life, students who learned to love truth, field assistants who trusted her maps, felt like a fragile scaffold against the machine they were now probing. She wondered if she had ever been brave, or just a woman tiny enough to be rearranged by the agencies she trusted. They spent the afternoon burning through data under a tarp of battery lights. Oris sat literally humming at the edge of their perception, a hovering calculus, and gave them access to what it could observe without violating its own statutes. It could not, Oris said, break certain seals, laws of a kind even alien diplomats respected. But it could point to anomalies, heat signatures smeared across orbital paths, biosigns that matched neither terrestrial nor known extraterrestrial genomic maps, and a series of flights traced to a private airstrip near a lake that did not exist on civilian charts. These manifests, Kai said, quoting, they're trying to make it look like agriculture so international oversight won't notice. His voice was a knife. They found faces in the files, engineers wearing official insignia, faces blurred on the periphery of cleanroom group photos, a child with the same glassy glint Elena had seen in Oris' memory. The hard drive shuddered with hints of everything they'd feared. When Elena saw the child's face, something like a rope tugged her heart. The child looked at the camera with a mixture of curiosity and learned caution, a gaze too aware, as if the world had a camera and a curriculum both. These kids, she whispered, where do they come from? Mateo shrugged like someone who had been asked to explain the weather. Nobody asks, nobody tells. They teach the children to think of themselves as experiments. The parents, some of them, are told the children were adopted. Some were told the children were evacuated from unsafe houses. Others never knew. Kai stared at the images until his teeth ground. If this is a breeding program, he said, the words tasting like concrete, it's not just about expansion. It's about weaponizable traits. Oris' response was a slow folding of light. They have been integrating. They searched for vectors through your institutions. They requested materials under pretexts of remediation. They sought immunological resilience and neuroplasticity. They did not ask permission from children. The envoy's absence of outrage was a kind of cold clarity that felt like frostbite. Your species is clever at rationalizing. When evening folded them into blue, Elena drove a thought into the hard question of culpability. She had signed a paper because she had believed in the institutional story of science as a public good. She had withheld the desire to look deeper because curiosity could be punished in a world where secrets kept people in power. The confession of that small abdication made her stomach roil. If we expose this, she said, the state will call it treason. They'll lock us up, or they'll discredit us. They'll broadcast that we're lying. Kai's jaw worked. They'll also try to capture Oris, he said. Think about it. If the government knows there's a technology that can cut memories or clear histories, what will they do? They'll weaponize the envoy, or they will force the envoy's tech into their machines. They'll create sanctuaries and call them safe while building arsenals beneath. Elena imagined a world where Oris's corridor became another thing to be owned. She imagined hybrid children becoming research commodities, their futures auctioned. She imagined her own signature, a seamstress's stitch in a garment that fit the powerful. The idea sickened her. At night, after they had encrypted files into layers of dead letter boxes and smeared signal pings to confuse prying radars, Elena lay awake watching the glow of Oris seek through the tent. The envoy had offered them a small window of communication. It could ferry facts out of town to its kind, but it could not publish them to human networks without creating breaks in temporal security Oris's people feared. Why help us at all? Elena asked it when the plateau was a bowl of cold stars. What do you gain? Oris did not answer with the human verbs of transaction. Instead, it gave her a memory, folding like a map, image upon image of worlds they had watched silent under consumptive species, of biodiversity that blinked out in patterns that matched human industrialization with disquieting similarity. We are stewards, Oris thought shaped. Some of us judge that non-interference becomes complicity when the cost is the annihilation of multiple minds. Others argue that your species must choose. I am sent to present the test. Elena turned the memory over like a possibility. If Oris was right, their species had rolled towards its future like a blind tribe of cartographers, sketching new maps on old wounds.
Would leaving save them from the moral commitment of correction? Or would it surrender every child and scientist left behind to an industry of secrecy? Kai slept as if sleep were betrayal, a hard, watchful thing. He had taken to waking and watching the plateau line long after dawn, as if the terrain was a piece of proof he could persuade to speak. Once he confided in Elena as the sky was a bruising watercolor. "When I had clearance," he said, "I saw operations that were justified as security. Each one was a little amputation. Privacy, rights, oversight. We thought we were preventing chaos, but preventing chaos turned into preventing people from knowing. The worst part is, sometimes the lies are kinder than the truth, but that doesn't make them right." Elena listened, and in his confession she heard the echo of her own cowardice, moments when she had signed a form and told herself that redactions were for the greater good. She wanted to say that she understood, but bottles of sorrow clinked in her throat. "We have to be better than that," she said instead. "We have to be brave in a way that also keeps the people we care about alive." Their first true obstruction came from a name that made Elena's skin go thin, the director of the classified program she'd endorsed, a woman from her past who had been both mentor and gatekeeper, Dr. Rosario Calder. Elena had pictured her in faculty photos, hands poised over the podium, a smile that cut like a scalpel. She'd trusted Rosario's assurances about containment once, and the taste of that trust now turned metallic. They tracked Rosario to a conference in Santiago. Kai arranged their attendance with the casual cruelty of a man who still knew how to bend small systems into doors. Elena saw her on stage, a silhouette of power in a blazer, an orator who made both the public and the private believe in the sanctity of research. After the talk, they followed Rosario to a private garden outside the hotel where cacti gathered like silent witnesses. Elena's heart pounded so loudly she worried it would sound like an alarm. They confronted her with the images and the fragment of the hard drive. Rosario's expression was an animal's, hunted but not yet broken. "You think I don't know," she said at last. "Elena, everything we've done has been to secure our people, humanity. You sign a paper, you think of bacteria and metrics. I think of survival. You can't decide for an entire species." Kai's face was a map of hurt. "You already decided," he said. "You didn't consult. You didn't ask if humanity wanted to be curated." Rosario's laugh was a dry wind. "Would you rather have us be wrong and fail at survival, or right and keep life? There are choices with no clean answers. You are historians of ethics, not governors of fate." Elena felt anger and betrayal like a fever. "You used children," she said. "You hid them." Rosario's gaze softened with the practiced cruelty of bureaucracy. "We sheltered what we had to."
We didn't know we were creating what you call hybrids. We were assembling resilience. It's a language game. And even if we did, what would you do? Tear their lives apart to make a point? The question sank into Elena like a hook. It had no easy answer. The moral architecture around them was not built of simple stones. It was a labyrinth of choices and justifications. They left the garden with more than they'd brought, a confession that the program had indeed been experimenting with children in colonies, but a denial of intent to weaponize, at least under Rosario's public cover. The truth, they learned, had edges that bent depending on who told it. Back on the plateau, Oris watched them assemble these shards with an alien patience that was both balm and icy disinfectant. "You have leverage," it noted. "You have stories. You have a human network willing to risk. This is a beginning." But beneath Oris' measured assessment was a warning they could not shake. The envoy's model of human social development indicated an accelerating slope. The moment of public exposure risked the state panicking and revealing the very thing they feared, or dragging Oris into politics and tearing the envoy's people into factions. "Your species fears uncertainty, so it clutches at control," Oris said. "Your institutions will respond not only with denial, but with acquisition." Elena felt the weight of that inevitability like gravity. They could expose the files tomorrow and set governments to seize Oris's technology out of fear, or they could stay quiet, build a slow coalition of whistleblowers and international oversight, and hope that time would be kind. The problem with hope, she realized, was that hope is a luxury of those who can survive its disappointments. Weeks collapsed into a blur of clandestine meetings, encrypted messages, and dinners that tasted like fear. They found a group of parents who suspected, a janitor who'd cleaned a lab and taken a photograph, a scientist who'd been complicit in the early days and now wore regret like a shawl. But with each piece of proof, the shape of their dilemma expanded until it became an orbit that threatened everything. Then, one night, as rain began to smear the plateau into watercolor, Elena's burner phone vibrated with an image, a screen capture of a broadcast cue.
Someone had tapped into a state network and queued a classified briefing to be aired in the event of a revelation. Dramatized as a national security response, it contained language about sanctioned containment, defensive fortifications, and procedural reassignment. The header was chillingly clear: Activation Protocol, Oris Engagement. Kai's face drained color. "They know," he said. "They're preparing to seize anything they think will preserve them." Elena's fingers hovered over the encrypted channels to Oris. The envoy's presence folded. A question asked of vacuum.
"If the state moves to activate a seizure of Oris technology," she asked, "what then?" Oris' reply came like a current through water. "We will defend our people. We will also defend your world if necessary. The use of force will create fractures we cannot predict." Elena swallowed. The cliff they stood at suddenly gained a gust. To broadcast now would be to risk turning Oris into a prize. To wait could mean the program would embed deeper and become unstoppable. And somewhere in the middle was the lives of children who might be living under the banner of enhanced resilience or something far more sinister. Kai looked up, the man who had spent his life cataloging risks, weighing incalculable probabilities. "We need a plan that isn't binary," he said. "We need to create a public pressure that makes taking Oris a political nightmare. We need allies who won't be silenced." "Who?" Elena asked. Her voice trembled with all the things unresolved: guilt, love of truth, the aching knowledge that in this equation, people's lives were variables. Kai's eyes hardened. "You know which communities will listen. Civil rights groups, independent journalists, international watchdogs. We can't trust our agencies. We trust the crowd that will scream if they know they're being lied to." Elena felt both terror and clarity. It was a plan that asked the world to become messy, angry, indignant, unpredictable. But it also returned agency to people who had been stripped of it by sealed programs. If they could ignite that indignation before the state moved, they might turn seizure into scandal, and scandal into oversight. But a plan like that would cost everything they valued: anonymity, safety, Oris patience, perhaps even lives. The plateau seemed to breathe around them, waiting for their choice. Oris' facets glittered with something almost like sympathy. "Your timeline shortens," it said. "Make your alliances. Decide. The year approaches." Between the hard drive and Elena's grasp, the list of names they'd compiled in the dirt, and the image of a child whose eyes refracted questions she had no answer to, Elena realized the dilemma narrowed into a single, terrible truth. Any action would wound something they loved. The question was only which wound they were willing to bear. They sat in the truck as rain washed the world clean and unmade their footprints. Kai lit a cigarette he didn't inhale. The motion was an old ritual, an invocation of the man who had been trained to watch for patterns and to hold his breath until the shape of danger revealed itself. Elena put her hand over the hard drive like a benediction. "If we do this," she said finally, "we do it together. No lone exposes. No martyrdom. We build a coalition, and we hit the nets hard enough to make the cost of seizure higher than the cost of transparency." Kai's laugh was flat but honest. "You sound like a campaign manager, dangerous and persuasive." Elena let herself smile, a thin crescent of hope in the rain.
"I sound like someone who once believed in institutions enough to sign a form and is trying, belatedly, to fix the harm." Oris' light dimmed to an almost private blue. "Then begin," it urged. "But remember, the state will not wait until you are ready. You have until the year 2026. Each day you delay, they sow more seams." The rain became a rhythm, a metronome for their next moves. Elena felt the pressure of three living things: the species that had birthed her, the man who had learned to shield truths until they became weapons, and the envoy who had opened a corridor and refused to judge her without offering a way forward. She thought of the children, of their eyes and the fragile dignity of a life built on secrecy. She thought of Rosario in the hotel garden, of her own signature, of the broken trust that stitched their lives into a single brittle fabric. As they drove back to their temporary camp, the plateau behind them a smear of shadow, Elena made a decision that tasted like iron and honey. They would not leave. They would not abandon the children and the betrayals to the silence of the cosmos. They would not hand Oris to a state that would make a god of its fear. They would ignite a firestorm of truth and demand to be held accountable for the consequences. It was a choice that would either save or shatter them. The moral calculus tightened into a single fierce flame. They would force humanity to look at itself, and perhaps to learn how not to be terrifying. By the time the headlights cut through the low clouds, Elena felt fatigue like honesty settling into her bones. The plateau had been a theater for one night's radical change. Now it would be a battlefield for the rest of their lives. The worst of war, she understood, was not bombs or images, but the quiet, steady work of staying human while the world practiced inhumanity. "Then we begin," Kai said. His voice was steady enough that Elena believed him. Oris folded their presence to a whisper. "We will open channels. We will give what we may. But remember, trust is not a tool. It is a risk." Elena folded the hard drive into her jacket like a relic. Outside, the rain erased their tracks as if the earth itself wanted to forget what had been trod. Inside, Elena felt the heat of worth and the cold of consequence braided together. The path ahead would be noisy, dangerous, and full of betrayals and small mercies. But for the first time since the crystalline blade had slid through her ribs, she felt something like resolve, rough, human, and real. And when the radio in Kai's dashboard crackled as a distant frequency pinged with a report of military movement near the private airstrip, Aura's faceted gaze sharpened. The world they had intruded upon was waking to the idea that someone might refuse silence. The choice Elena had made would not let them rest. The plateau behind them dissolved into the mist. Ahead, the map of their mission unfurled like a challenge.
The broadcast cue on Kai's burner had been a warning flare. The next revelation was a grenade. They moved fast because the world they'd awakened never gave a second to breathe. Elena drafted messages with the meticulousness of a lab notebook, strings of proof and questions, encoded for journalists who still believed in the work of public truth. Kai orchestrated contact lists like a conductor, trusted reporters, rights lawyers, and international ethics consortiums still angry enough to act. Matteo agreed to hide the most damning files on physical drives and ferry them to a safe house outside the country. Rosario, cold, elegant, infuriating, kept to her story in public, but their intercepted communications had a tremor Elena could taste, a chain of veiled threats, a request for extraordinary military presence near the airstrip, a protocol called Activation Orion. Then betrayal came like snow in a desert, unexpected, white, and fatal. It was a small thing at first. A journalist they trusted, a woman named Layla who had broken smaller government stories before, went dark after agreeing to meet. Her last message was a simple, "I can push this, meet me." And then nothing. Her feed went silent, her editor stopped answering calls, and later that night a clip surfaced, grainy, edited, a frame of Elena's face taken from a lecture years ago and spliced into a doctored confession. In the video, Elena laughed and said things she would never say. She was smiling over footage of children playing, endorsing the very experiments she had promised to expose. The doctored clip ran on a state-affiliated network as evidence of treachery. Kai's hands shook when he played it. "They've mounted a psychological campaign," he said. "They discredit first, then isolate, then capture." Elena wanted to be furious, to tear open the nearest throat with words, but fury tasted like metal. The video slid under the skin. Someone had the resources to shape truth, and they used her like a glove. Who leaked Layla? Elena asked. Trust, she realized, was not only a risk, it was currency and a target. Matteo did not answer his phone. When they found his truck upended in a storm wash 2 valleys away, the hard drives were gone. There was no sign of his body, only scorch marks on the riverbank, and a half-burned envelope with Elena's signature printed on a label. The envelope was empty, as if someone wanted to make sure guilt could be pointed at her hands. Kai shut his eyes and made a sound like someone pressing thumb to a bleeding wound. "They have an internal list," he said. "They know who we've talked to. They can reroute supply chains, intercept safe houses. Someone high up is harvesting dissent and killing it before it grows." Oris's light pulsed,
a viscous, slow blink that felt like sympathy programmed into an alien system.
It offered them satellite imagery of Mateo's truck and the airstrip, visuals of a convoy moving under cover of night. But where it could have supplied names, it merely indicated procedure, containment vectors, likely operatives, patterns of state suppression that matched other history files Oris had archived. The envoy's inability to give them everything was a kind of mercy. It was also maddening. Elena's brittle certainty began to splinter. She had imagined a linear path: gather proof, release it, force accountability. Instead, everything she did created counterwaves. The doctored confession, Mateo's disappearance, were they random blows or calculated moves to fracture the group? She caught herself watching Kai more often, reading his face for the signs of a man reclaiming the habits of an intelligence officer. "You're not sleeping," she said once, quietly, as they sat in the back of the truck with the heater whispering useless warm air. "I don't sleep when I know they're listening," Kai said. His voice was flat. "And I don't sleep because there are things I did that might come back to make things worse." He didn't have to finish. His past was an open wound between them. Elena noticed how his hands, when he talked, returned to an old tic, thumb rubbing the pad of his forefinger, a motion that once kept him alive in briefings, and now made the tent feel like a confession booth. Their arguments were small at first: where to cash a drive, whether to contact an ally in Geneva, but the cracks widened with the size of what they were building. Kai accused Elena, once, of being naive and assuming that she could play warden to states and scientists alike. Elena accused Kai of believing in the army of transparency while keeping secrets of his own. They loved each other with a desperate, growing tenderness, but love in the time of collapsing institutions is a complicated map that often fails to guide. One night, after a particularly sharp conversation that ended in silence so loud they could hear the tense seams whisper, Elena found in her jacket pocket a receipt she did not recognize, a transaction timestamped from an encrypted bank she'd never used. It listed payment to an entity named Calder Solutions, a shell company that matched Rosario's family holdings. The amount was large, intended to bribe, it seemed, a certain type of mutinous. "Who sent this?" she asked Kai. He paled. "I cleaned my tracks," he said slowly, "but I left a ghost in one place. I thought it was safe. Someone followed the breadcrumb." The confession landed like ice. "I had to keep a line open to people who might help. I didn't tell you because I thought telling you would make you a risk." Elena felt the sting of that omission like betrayal. "You kept me out of it," she said. "You made a solitary decision about our work." "It was meant to protect you," he said quickly, "not to control you." Their relationship became a ledger of unshared risks, a catalog of omissions. The intimacy they'd been building, quiet confessions under Oris glints, shared coffees at collapsed dawn, was now inked with lies they had not intended. Elena could not help to see the pattern play out, secrecy begetting secrecy, each a small rationalization, until one day the whole thing was a program and not a person. They were hardly the only fractures. Volunteers they'd recruited deserted after being threatened with arrests. A rights group they'd thought immutable sent a terse refusal when a server leak hinted at diplomatic complications. Even Oris seemed to soften in contact. Not pity, but a measured distance, perhaps the alien equivalent of a human's cooling when trust fails. The most gutting fracture came when they finally forced Rosario into a corner in the garden again, this time with clearer evidence and a journalist ready to air everything. Rosario's hands were steady. Her voice had the calm of someone who'd practiced moral panics into speeches. "Expose me," she said, "and you'll expose a dozen lives. You'll start a chain that will end with people experimenting in basements to catch up. Progress won't stop because you scream at it. It will hide and become primitive and worse." This was the kind of argument Elena found morally slamming, a warning that exposure would not cure corruption but might scatter it, making harm harder to track. But the camera didn't care for that nuance. The journalist's fingers hovered over a record button. Layla, found, bruised and frightened, stood behind the lens with eyes like broken glass. She had been forced to relay a narrative of betrayal, of threats that had left her silence a price. When the first file hit global feeds, proof of the orbital modules, the unregistered children, the government briefings, reactions were immediate and violent. Some marched, some called for martial law. Some whispered about extraterrestrial collaborators and named Oris an interloper to be neutralized. The state moved with the swiftness of a cornered beast. Tanks appeared near the airstrip, and a military blacklist circulated with names they recognized. In the chaos, Elena felt the jagged edge of her own culpability. She had wanted to force truth into daylight. Daylight had lit up every shadow. People they'd tried to protect were swept by the tides of panic they had unleashed. Children in remote facilities were relocated under emergency powers. Matea remained missing. Kai's past, hidden deals, channels he had maintained, was dredged and presented as proof that the whistleblowers were part of an elaborate coup. They were being broken by the very thing they'd hoped would save the world: attention. The fractures were not only political. Elena and Kai fought like two halves of a heart trying to pump in a body that had been cut. He wanted to go to the places the tanks were and find Matteo, or at least stop the seizures. She wanted to stay and manage the release, to feed the journalists with curated facts that could anchor public demand into policy.
Neither path felt sufficient, and every choice was a potential moral wound. Oris watched them as humanity did what humanity does best in crisis. It invented enemies and forgot the people who made them. The envoy's edges dimmed. "You have pushed the species into awareness," it said. "That will force choice. But you also have torn bonds. The fractures you foresaw are now under your hands. Decide who you will be in them." Elena pressed the hard drive to her chest like a talisman, feeling the electricity of blame and love. Kai stood at the tent flap, rain striking the canvas, and for a beat, they were two people unmoored in a storm of their own making. The world outside howled. Inside, their own private fracture bled into everything. "This was never going to be neat," Kai said. And in the apology of it, there was something like truth. They clung to each other then, brief, raw, and human, because there was nothing else to do when the world demanded accounts and offered only conflict in exchange. The plateau behind them had become an arena of public and private war, and the brittle bones of alliances snapped in the wind. They were together and not, brave and foolish and terrified. Their plan to force transparency had worked, and in working, it had fractured everything it touched. The choice ahead was no longer only about leaving or staying. It was about whether they could stitch the world back together, or whether their efforts would instead become the very force that made humans more terrifying than before. They held each other until the rain stitched them pale and numb, and the world outside the tent thrummed with the drums of a state that had finally chosen to unmask itself. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The plateau around them was a basin of sighs, satellite dishes like ears, Oris a faceted sentinel in the corner of perception. Then Kai untangled his fingers from Elena's and reached for the bag where his old tools lived like relics of a life he'd tried to surrender. An RF jammer, an access key, a scorch and dump drive that could fry focused arrays for exactly 7 minutes. "You can't do this," Elena said, before she could stop herself. And the words were everything she'd been saving: accusation, fear, the shape of a plea. He smiled, not a triumphant thing, but a small, terribly human concession. "I've spent my life buying time with misdirection," he said. "This is the only honest trick I have left." Reconciliation arrived like a tide, simple, fierce, and immediate. They spoke the things that had been unsaid, the confessions of small cowardices, the apologies that finally fit. Elena told him about the quiet ways she'd rationalized redactions. Kai told her about the operations he'd authorized while thinking the ends would justify the means. Each admission was a shoring plank, each forgiveness a rivet. When they kissed, it was not clean or cinematic, but messy and true. Two people learning the rhythm of one another after a long, painful separation.
Plans in hand, they moved with the hushed urgency of people who knew the scoreboard of consequence. The coalition Elena had seeded woke in chaotic bursts: activists, independent journalists, a hesitant but honest international watchdog that had seen enough to act. Oris agreed to a limited intervention. It would open a corridor, a pale seam in space-time large enough to ferry a number of children and a few designated adults to a sanctuary. But there was price and logic to alien mercy. Oris could not simply pluck thousands out of a world without reshaping politics. Every corridor used would flare on the sensors of militaries already jittery with paranoia.
The envoy proposed a diversion that would make seizure impossible for exactly 7 minutes, the same window Kai's devices could hold. He looked at Elena then, hair spiking from rain, eyes hollow but luminous. "I can buy you that window," he said, "but I won't get through with you. If you go through the corridor with Oris, I'll stay. I'll stay and make noise, and the state will have to expend everything trying to catch a ghost. Oris can scrub my ties, my name will become fog in some registries, but I don't want to be fogged to you." Elena's hands trembled against his chest. It was the kind of choice that cleaved everything simple into shards. The academic in her catalogued probabilities. The human in her catalogued longing. To leave with Oris was to accept an exile that might save children and some portion of knowledge. To stay with Kai was to risk both of them being broken by a state that had already decided how to treat those who betrayed it. "No," she said. Not the word of rejection, but the start of another plan. "We don't let this be only one of us. We do this together." They argued like lovers revising a desperate plot until the sky lightened to a bruise and Oris's facets came alive with the geometry of departure. The envoy could, it said, bend memory selectively, erase the map of how to find corridors, smooth the internet traces that led to safe houses, but not without consent. It could also, begrudgingly, render one human identity into an indistinct record for the sake of secrecy. Elena realized this was the instrumentality Oris feared, that a species of caretakers might be tempted to tidy away the messy reality of consequences. The action began when dawn was thin and the military's headlights were a beast at the edge of a dream. Mateo's hidden caravans rolled toward the private airstrip with the children bundled in layers and eyes wide with the kind of terror that does not yet have words. Elena, Kai, and a handful of allies moved like ragged hymns, journalists broadcasting raw feeds, activists forming human shields, Oris humming a synchronization across frequencies they could barely touch. Kai planted the jammer on a ridge before the convoys could converge. He kissed Elena then, a kiss that promised nothing easy, only a devotion carved into risk.
"If no other way comes," he said, voice thick, "remember there was someone who loved you enough to choose." She fought the tears and fitted his face into her memory like a talisman. "Choose me back," she whispered. When Kai activated the jammer, the world tilted. Radios went soft, encryption glitched, and the military command's delicate choreography became a scramble. Oris pushed its corridor open like a slow peel of sky. For 7 minutes, an hour, a lifetime, light cut a path and children moved through it in a line of small hands and frightened faces, their bodies vanishing into a place made not of secrecy, but of something like mercy. The state did not merely stand by. They moved with the cruelty of those who feel betrayed. Armored vehicles converged, a strike team raced the ridge, and the net of cameras flashed like a modern execution. Kai held them off as best he could, diverting drones with signal pulses, feeding false telemetry, and every so often turning to shout instructions to Elena. He was not a soldier, but an operative of memory, a person who had learned how to manipulate attention as if it were a weapon. He was good at making people look where he wanted. He was better at making himself into the thing everyone could not help but hunt. When the final child stepped through and Oris's seam began to fold, Kai sustained a pulse so violent that he overloaded his jammer and himself. The strike team reached the ridge at the same moment Oris sealed the corridor. Elena watched as masked figures moved with precise brutality. She watched Kai fall against the rocks, hands smoking from the device, face ashen but smiling, because the corridor had stayed open long enough for mercy. He was captured, not killed, and the capture was a strange mercy in itself. The state wanted trophies, confessions, leverage, a demonstration that traitors could be remade into examples. Kai looked at Elena with a tenderness that broke the world into shards. "Go," he mouthed. "Take whatever you can, make it count." She wanted to crawl into the space beside him, to be taken as well, to shout and to splinter the plans that had led them here. But the truck where Oris waited hummed like an animal ready to flee. Elena pressed the hard drive, the repository of truth, into Oris's light and gave Kai what she could, a promise she would return, that his sacrifice would not be the final ledger of their love. Oris's corridor closed with the soft mechanical click of inevitability. Elena slid into the seam with the last dozen children, their fingers gripping hers like vows. The world contracted into a small bright tunnel, and she felt Kai's hand brush her sleeve as the light swallowed them, an almost human touch that grounded her in fear and devotion. Later, there would be later, news would